We all know the iconic ships of the Rebel Alliance fleet, the Blockade Runner, the GR-75 Transport, the Nebulon B, Mon Calamari cruisers, you know, and while previously obscure ships like the Dornian gunship are finally getting some widespread recognition, there remain a number of unexplored and almost completely unknown ships right under our noses in the original trilogy. I thought it was high time to finally flesh out some of these ships, so I tackled what is essentially the most prominent of these mystery ships, which is seen as part of the Rebel fleet at the end of The Empire Strikes Back. In fact, at least 3 of these ships are visible, which makes it all the more odd that it's never been officially fleshed out in Star Wars canon. Considering the complete lack of references and official data for this ship, to figure this one out, I had to start basically from scratch, and I started by blocking out the shapes over screenshots of the movie. Fortunately, we have several different angles of the ship, and getting the basic shapes and proportions wasn't actually that hard, but the fine details is a completely different story. Like virtually all Star Wars shooting miniatures, this one uses parts kit-bashed from various model kits, but the technique is a bit more blatant on this ship, which includes the Apollo command module and pieces of the Saturn V rocket. But most of the details, even after hours of research, are still anybody's guess. This weird sausage-shaped detail between the pods is a bit hard to understand, but I'm pretty convinced that this is actually a dish with protruding radial elements. So this is probably the most accurate we're gonna get for this ship, but honestly I didn't like how it looked, and the ship is so blurry anyway that I thought it was fair to change some things up. I moved the dish backward and made room for a cockpit, and I ultimately replaced the dish with something that more resembled the dish on the Corellian Corvette. The final product was something that I liked a lot better, and thus the Rebel tanker ship was born. I imagine that this relatively small ship of about 45 meters would serve the role of an in-flight refueling ship for fighter squadrons operating far from a mothership or a proper base. Ships in Star Wars need fuel after all. The tanks were just too obvious to pass up, and a more mundane, industrial, blue-collar kind of ship appealed to me. Moving on to Return of the Jedi, just before the Rebel fleet jumps to Endor, 2 mystery ships appear in the same shot together. This is incidentally one of the shots where we get our best look at the Dornian gunship, but while that ship got a lot of love in Rebels and in Rogue One, these 2 ships remain completely unknown. That is, until I happened across some reference of the original shooting miniatures. And while draconian policies strictly forbid me to share exactly what I saw, you'll just have to trust me when I tell you that these sketches are fairly accurate. This ship looks suspiciously a little like the old expanded universe Dreadnought class heavy cruiser, and while the profile is similar, I assure you that the details are quite different. But they certainly differ greatly in the finer details, which on the original miniature are actually mostly just scribbled on with a marker. It's pretty funny to imagine the original ILM model maker, who knew for a fact that the ship would be a blurry blob on screen and didn't waste any time applying details that you would never see. Until now. But as far as the detail that does exist, the entire back third of the ship is literally the kit-bashed thruster assembly of the Saturn V rocket. Some pipes and tubes later, and you have yourself a little cruiser, or something. From this point, it was almost entirely up to me to bring it from a low-detail maquette to a fully functional starship, but I wanted to stay close to the spirit of the details on the original model, so I very faithfully included the Saturn V thrusters with just a little bit of extra Star Wars detailing. And I actually honored some of the painted hull details. For instance, regular circular shapes evoked windows. The end product is actually a pretty coherent ship, which I scaled to about 60 meters. Incidentally, this makes the thrusters in the back the same scale as their real-life kit-bash origins, and I thought that was a fun touch. I figured this ship was some dingy old transport retrofitted for wartime. It's not particularly heavy-armed, but it does have a fairly large turret, 2 anti-fighter guns, and some fixed guns and torpedo tubes on the chin. Finally, we come to what I've considered a Mon Calamari Corvette. The Mon Cal fleet, despite its popularity, is actually somewhat sparse, and it's populated almost entirely by massive cruisers, and the idea of a smaller Mon Cal ship appealed to me. And while it's hard to tell from the movie because of the small details being smudged out, this pod is actually a part of the ship, and I assume it's the bridge, which easily sets the scale for the ship. At least a general ballpark scale. I settled on 250 meters, which makes its length somewhere between the Corellian Corvette and the Nebulon B. For the detailing, a crucial design element is its wings, which are actually invisible from the side, but if you see the miniature, it actually has kit-bashed wings from the space shuttle. I follow the shape of the space shuttle wings pretty closely, but I opted to somewhat Star Wars-ify the back end by adding engines and greeblies. I also took some creative liberty with the underside. I added escape pods, turrets, and an underslung pod, which I felt somewhat balanced out the design. In general, most of the details were completely at my discretion because the original miniature is really low detail, but extensively studying the hull detailing of other Mon Cal ships helped inform the process, and I am very happy with the final design. Something to remember is that these are all actually canonical designs. And while I've somewhat interpreted the designs through my creative lens, I feel that they're pretty authentic to the intent of the original ships. Here we have 3 vessels of the Rebel fleet that for decades have gone unnoticed by the Star Wars universe, both in canon and in the real world. And I would love to flesh out more ships like this and to actually come up with designations and stats for each of them. If you have suggestions for other mystery ships that I could take a look at, let me know. And if you have ideas for what these ships are called and what their specific roles and specifications are, I'd love to hear that. I like sharing my work here, so if you want to see more of my 3D models and designs, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos. To all of you, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.